Okay, welcome back. We are welcome back to our stage here at DPC. We're going to have a conversation with Anika Goss Foster, a graduate of Leadership Detroit Class 26, Executive Director of Detroit Future City. There's some 26ers in the room. All right. There's a 17er in the room, Dan Dolson and myself. I want to give a shout out to Kresge for sponsoring this work and also for being our sponsor here in the exhibit hall. So Kresge doing great work. Good listeners, good collaborators, right? Right on. So we're going to talk about the Community Investment Index, which is hot off the press. So Anika, this report has just come out. You've been doing this work for a few years with this report. So talk about, what are the key takeaways of this 2019 report?
Well, actually, thank you for having me. And I'm excited to talk about the Detroit Reinvestment Index. This is actually the fourth year of the index. And Kresge Foundation had been producing the report themselves. And so this year was the first year that Detroit Future City took the report over. And they did that for a couple of reasons. So we worked on it together with Kresge, but one of the things they wanted to do was that when they were leading with it, it had more of a limited audience, right? It was more philanthropic and a corporate audience. They really wanted the report to become Detroit's report, Detroit's sort of benchmark for how they do from year to year. And then the second thing they had asked us to do was to use it as a engagement tool to be able to inform people on the ground about how Detroit is growing and changing. And I think we were able to do that this year. So we're excited about it.
That's cool. So, like you said, the report's been around since 16.
Yeah.
While talking about the takeaways in this one, what have you seen since that 2016 report?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that's really exciting for us is that national business leaders continue to be excited about investing in Detroit. And that was something that we had, you would assume, right, because Detroit's markets are growing, downtown and investment is growing. But I think what we hadn't anticipated was the amount of national business leaders that were this excited about investing in Detroit and the direction that Detroit was going in. I think the other thing that we did in this report that we hadn't done that we were able to highlight, it was in previous reports, but we really highlighted it in this one, was the view of suburban Detroiters about how they're feeling about their own neighborhoods.
Yeah, talk a little about, because that's, and you see a Detroit-centric report.
Yeah.
You're like, you don't expect to see suburbanites sort of weighing in on their neighborhoods and how they're seeing the world. And yet, clearly, this thing leans towards that, and you guys felt it was important to get that voice.
We did, and one of the reasons why we felt that was so important is because as we continue to track Detroit's growth, we also need to understand and really position Detroit as the regional leader, which it is. It's the largest city in the state. So Detroit leads this entire region in terms of investment and economic growth and opportunity. So it's really important that we understand how all of the residents in Southeast Michigan feel about growth and redevelopment, whether it's in Detroit or whether it's in their own neighborhoods. And I think what was so surprising when we actually took that, and this was a consumer survey, so we were calling people and emailing them. We didn't. FTI and Associates, which is a national firm that does that work. But when we were asking them about it, I think what was so surprising to us was that the number of the little difference there was between how suburbans were feeling about Detroit and how suburbanites were feeling about their own neighborhoods and how Detroiters were feeling about Detroit and growth in their own neighborhoods. There are a lot of similarities. And I think often we believe that suburban Suburbanites feel so differently, right? Like those people over there and how they feel about Detroit is often how we look at it. And there were actually a lot fewer differences than we had anticipated.
Yeah, I noticed that there may be just on sort of self-identification of crime or safety, there might have been a little difference, but the trends tracked with Detroiters and suburbanites. I also say that it makes great political sense to engage suburbanites. I mean, it just makes total sense, and it kind of you kind of walk the walk, talk the talk, like everybody's in this together.
That's right. And I think that there are some key issues, not just around crime, but around how people feel about education. Was very, very similar, how they prioritized education, how they prioritized the transition of whether or not people were moving into their own neighborhood. Those were all very similar, whether you lived in Detroit or the suburbs. Their households want to be in good neighborhoods with good neighbors. And that's really important no matter where you live in Southeast Michigan. And they also want the kind of businesses that support their community. So they don't just want any new business. They want a business that supports their quality of life, that provides adequate jobs, that's affordable for them so that they can actually use that business and that business becomes an asset. That trend was the same in Detroit as it was in the suburbs.
I read it a few times and I couldn't get over the perceptions around bankruptcy. It's absolutely amazing, the mystique around where we're at around bankruptcy. And when you talk about Detroiters and suburbanites almost tracking identical, you think us Detroiters would know our garbage getting picked up, we got city services going, something must be going on, but it's almost like suburbanites and Detroiters still confused about where we're at. And so just say a little bit more about that.
Well, it was really, I think what surprised us was the national business leaders. That, because you could probably say, because we were interviewing residents and households, if you're not following the news, you may not know where Detroit is on the bankruptcy trajectory, right? But national business leaders, we really expected that for 43% of national business leaders to still think that Detroit was in some form of bankruptcy was really surprising. And I really think that, we talked a lot about that in the office as well and with the Kresge Foundation. And we really believe that it's very likely that some of this is on us and on how Detroit views its own issues around bankruptcy. The culture of Detroit is just to move, okay, this was a problem, we fixed it, and now we're moving forward and forging ahead, right? And that's sort of our attitude of anything that goes wrong here in Detroit, where we're not talking about bankruptcy. We don't talk about it in the media as much anymore. We don't talk about it at conferences like this anymore, right? It's old news. That was 5 years ago. Why are we still talking about that? But I think for the rest of the United States, the national business leaders are still considering bankruptcy as an issue and as a test of how the government is actually run here.
Yeah, can they trust the city with the residents, with city council, government? Can they, the street lights are going to be on, things are going to happen. And 31% of national business leaders believed we were out of bankruptcy. And what happened to their interest in investing? It spiked over 80%. For that 31%. That was amazing. Yes.
I mean, and it was still high for those that thought that we were almost out of bankruptcy.
Yeah, which was also was really interesting
65%. Yeah, so I think that all, fares very well for us as a city. You know what I thought was really interesting that came out of the report that I think is important to note, that national business leaders actually, it was about even between when we asked leaders whether or not they would choose Detroit as a city, or no, not choose Detroit, but whether they would choose a city that had more amenities, but was more expensive to live in, as opposed to a city with fewer amenities but less expensive, which would be like a city like Detroit. And it was about half. It was about 51-43 or something like that. That said that they would be willing to invest in a city that was lower cost but had lower amenities. I think that's a really, really important point to note for the future, for how we think of ourselves as a city, how we can market ourselves, how we can attract other business leaders or businesses and corporations here to Detroit.
Yeah, I mean, that runs a little bit against sort of the tendency that folks are going to amenity-rich communities. In fact, there's a big school of thought, even in this conference, that we need an amenity-rich community, tax-supported community to attract the kind of talent we need for the future, and that's really interesting.
I think what I really think is that there is a trend that as a corporation, you can move into a town and actually make a really big impact. And I think the businesses that have come to Detroit in the past 10 years, you have been able to demonstrate that, right? That you've seen with Quicken and with other companies can come into town, have a large impact, can make a real difference, can encourage employees to move to the city. And I think that that's something that we should really look at and think about for the future.
Yeah. So this report takes a little turn. Detroit, 137 square miles. You guys, actually have a report on Detroit, 137 square miles. And so it seems from a homeowner perspective, we haven't felt the pinch of gentrification and affordability. However, renters are beginning to feel the pinch, and especially Detroiters who are renting are starting to get worried about affordability as this report pulls out.
Yeah, we actually, there was a very specific question that we asked households whether or not you felt like you were being forced to move, or whether you were forced to move, or whether you were fearful of having to move because of redevelopment specifically, which is the gentrification question. And the majority on both sides, the vast majority, were not fearful and never had to move, right? Both on Detroiters and the suburbanites. However, the group of Detroiters, of renters in particular, there were 42% of them that were fearful of having to move. Now, it's a very small percentage of them that actually had to move and felt like they might have to move again. But that is really important. The reason why we feel like that particular point is important to note, and this was both in Detroit and in the suburbs, it was not just here in the city, is that we don't have the systems in place to really protect renters the way we do homeowners with the Headley Amendment that protects homeowners from any real tax changes. So I think that because we don't have the systems in place, where there are communities that are growing and changing very, very quickly, I think the most vulnerable population, especially because the majority now of Detroiters are renters by 53%, I think this is something to really pay attention to make sure that we can protect renters as we continue to grow and change as a city.
Yeah, and it's part of our DNA as a city. We are the single home mecca, right? I mean, you look at this city and you look at any other major cities, and there's no mid-rise, there's not a density of high-rise. We are a homeowner, and we know then through a couple of housing booms and fails that a number of those properties went to sort of outside investors, absentee landlords. So kind of the nature of even the DNA of Detroit even makes that scenario potentially more of a concern.
It is, absolutely, and it was as much of a concern in the suburbs as well, because of the households that did have to move, it was almost the same between Detroiters and suburbanites. And in some cases, there was more suburbanites that were forced to move than Detroiters. I think as a region, because we are a region that's built on a home ownership, a single family home ownership strategy, going back to World War II, that we don't really have good systems in place for renters. And now that we are a renter majority community, we have just really got to be focused on affordability and making sure that renters are stable here in Detroit and across the region.
Yeah, we don't want a remake of public housing. We know that failure and that's been under redesign. But that's also informing some of your other work. And I know that hearing from a number of people, I wasn't there, but the equity gathering you had was an absolute success, smashing success, and is really energizing your work. So that fits into this report, right? So talk a little bit about that work.
Well, yeah, so we did launch our new Center for Equity, Engagement, and Research at Detroit Future City last Wednesday, and Angela Glover Blackwell, the founder of PolicyLink, was in town to help us launch that. But yeah, so at Detroit Future City, we're trying to position ourselves to be Detroit's think tank. We want Detroiters to be able to rely on us for data and information that will help us all look towards the future. We need to be really focused at conferences like these and at other whether you're here or whether you're at the neighborhood level, you need to be able to understand how how Detroit grows and changes. And we need to be positioned to make sure that everyone is included in that change. And so there's a real opportunity for us to begin to measure what that growth looks like in the future and how we can all make sure that everyone is included in that growth.
I spent 8 years with Housing and Urban Development, and I know that affordable housing just doesn't come in a voluntary nature. There has to be policy, there has to be thinking, there has to be political leadership. It can't necessarily be knee-jerk based on investments or so on and so forth. We got to get to it and start building up the pieces to ensure that it's going to be in place, and that and new administrations and new councils can continue to build on that.
Yeah, what I think that's a really important point, that the intentionality of all of this is going to be critical for us to be successful. And as we begin to move forward with the center and we're identifying indicators that we want to measure for the future, I'm really hoping that it will put all of us on notice, that all of us need to be paying attention to our own intentionality and how we move forward. And whether it's an economic issue, whether it's a sustainability issue, whether it's a health issue or an education issue, this has to be how we look at our systems to make sure that we're all growing the kind of region that we can all prosper in.
You've, just to close us out, you've led Detroit Future City through a lot of iterations. I mean, some changes, right? This thing has changed when I think about the original idea and the gathering and how it's morphed. And so as you look ahead to the next decade, what do you aspire to? I mean, I feel like there's just a new energy. I really do. I'm really excited for you guys.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
I'm really excited. I feel like we will be doing our job if there are the president of the block club and the president of a major corporation are actually working together using the same information to make Detroit a better place. I feel like I can move on and feel like my work is done here.
Anika, thank you so much. I appreciate the conversation. You bet.
Okay.